to Russian History with Dr. Brovkin. This video is devoted to the continuation of our discussion of Russian politics in 1917 during the first phase of the revolution. Last time we talked about the actions of the Party of Socialist Revolutionaries and the April crisis with Milyukov and the June crisis with the Kerensky offensive. Today I would like to focus on the Russian Social Democrats, commonly known as the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. Now, to make it simple, in a most simplistic ways, Social Democrats are those that are Mensheviks. Those that later became to be known as the Communists were the Bolsheviks. For many years, they were one political party that was called Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party. And then they added M for Mensheviks and B for Bolsheviks. Now, what is the difference between them? At first, there was very little. They were arguing about who could be a member of the party. Lenin insisted they had to be professional revolutionaries. Martov insisted that they had to be just paying the dues and participate in the revolutionary movement. It didn't seem like there was a fundamental difference between them. But as it turned out, it will become very fundamental. Basically, the Mensheviks wanted to improve the conditions of the working class. They were Marxists. They believed in capitalism and socialism and social reform, etc. And the Bolsheviks were the ones who slowly were getting much more radical, and at first they denied the possibility of the socialist revolution, but then they did embrace it in terms of the dictatorship of the proletariat and the destruction of capitalism. But all that wasn't clear at the first. At first they were pretty much one working class party that was a Marxist party. They had them delegates in the Duma, in the parliament. They published newspapers. Most of their leaders were journalists. Most of them lived abroad in Zurich, in London, in Geneva, and they had these conferences and debates, etc., etc., etc. But in 1917, this is what our focus is. They were perhaps the most important political party because they were in both, as I mentioned before, in the provisional government and in the Petrograd Soviet. The Tseretelli was the minister in all of the coalition governments beginning in crisis in April. Fyodor Dan was the chairman of the Central Executive Committee of Soviets, which means an all-Russian organization that controlled or directed the actions of local Soviets all over Russia. And Chidze was the Petrograd Soviet chairman. He was a Georgian Menshevik. So these people had pretty much a very, very powerful position in the provisional government and in the Soviets. Now, as I mentioned before, the main thrust of their policies on domestic policy and in foreign policy. In domestic policies, it was peace in the class peace. And that meant in practice a coalition government with the socialist revolutionaries first of all, and then with the cadets, with the constitutional democrats. That remained the main focus and the main principle of Menshevik policy in 1917, which was pretty much the author of that was Tseretelli. The second part of it concerned foreign policy. In foreign policy, they divided themselves into two parts. Those that were considered defensists and those that wanted internationalists. The defensists said Russia should be defended against foreign aggression, and those, that is German, and those that were internationalists believed that they had to seek for peace, and they did send a delegation to Germany, and Germany actually passed the famous Reichstag resolution in 1917, and there was some hope that they would be able to prevail, and their goal was to start peace negotiations immediately, to force the Allies to start peace negotiations immediately. But in the end, they failed in that endeavor. In terms of the domestic policy, they did a lot, as I mentioned before. They encouraged the growth of the trade unions. They created mutual aid funds. They created insurance for unemployment. They most importantly created the joint committees of the enterprise owners and the workers for joint management of enterprises, so that there was no class war but class cooperation. They were committed to democracy in a sense that they wanted to convene the Constituent Assembly on one man, one vote, one woman, one vote, one person, one vote principle that was supposed to be the product of political activity in 1917. So this is what they tried to do in this context, but there were severe uh, difficulties, as we have discussed those before. Now, the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks, at first, as I mentioned before, were not that different from the Mensheviks. In fact, in the first couple of months of 1917, there were hardly any differences at all. Lenin was still in exile, and nobody had any other ideas to advance the socialist revolution, which seemed like an absurdity for most of them. But the situation would change with the arrival of Lenin in April 1917. A few words about Lenin and his position in 1917. In January 1917, he wrote he wrote a very interesting phrase that his generation of leaders, he said, would probably not live to the times of the revolution. In other words, there was no indication in January 1917 that the collapse of the empire and of the Tsarism is coming. He had no calculation whatsoever. He made himself a reputation of an internationalist. In the context of social democratic parties of Europe, that meant those that did not want to support the war. They were a small minority. The majority of social democrats in all countries did support the war credits, Social Democratic Party of Germany, Socialist Party of France, etc. But Lenin said, no, we don't want to support the war, and these people were called internationalists. Now, the most important party of this internationalists was the so-called USPD, or Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany, which didn't completely split from the German Social Democratic Party, but was close to it. Now, they were in the same position. They were extreme left wing. Now, Lenin went much farther, and this is what's so important. Already in 1916, he was talking about turning the civil war, turning the imperialist war into the civil war. That was his principle. Now, that seemed like extreme, absurd position, but he basically said defeat of Tsarism could only be achieved if it is weakened by defeat in the war. Therefore, defeat in the war is good for his party. As I said, it was such an extreme position that nobody took it seriously because it pretty much bordered on treason. Nevertheless, that was Lenin's position, and therefore it was noticed by the German general staff, and they did give them money. Now, a lot of people say now that he was a German agent because he was taking money. All this is total nonsense. He was not a German agent, but he did take money from the German general staff. That these two don't contradict each other. He was ready to take money from anybody, from whatever source, as long as it promotes his political agenda, which is to weaken the power of the Tsar, create conditions for the revolution, and, if possible, seize power. So it is in this context that he comes to Russia in a so-called sealed train. That now there's a lot of discussion about why sealed. Yes, he did go from Switzerland across Germany to Finland and then to Russia. Why in sealed? The reason for the sealed part of it was because he wanted to show by that he had no connection to the German general staff or to German whatsoever. There was no contact at all. This is why it was sealed. But of course, that's not true. He did have contact. They did receive the money. Moreover, the Germans counted on his coming to Russia because they hoped that his presence in Russia would weaken Russian military effort, and if possible, if their wildest dreams come true, Lenin's party would come to power and stop the war. And that is exactly what happened. So he did come to Russia, and that changed political situation considerably. Lenin redefined completely the political agenda of the Bolsheviks. In most simple terms, beginning with April, he put two things forward in terms of the policy to the war and in terms of social policy that his party was going to conduct. Now, in terms of the war, he basically termed it like this. He didn't say we want the defeat of Russia. That would have been too much. But he's put it very bluntly. We He created a slogan for the army, which was bayonets into the ground and go home. It was a very clever formulation. It didn't speak about civil war, but it actually responded to the feeling at the front of millions of soldiers that the war should stop. And it encouraged desertion. And this is what Lenin did. Let's put it bluntly. Lenin's policy was to destroy the Russian army that could be used internally against revolution, against his party, and therefore he decided to undermine it. And undermining was under the slogan of democratization of the party, of the army, which means election of officers, which means the commissars would verify what the officers were doing. The cases of murder of officers, mass desertion, it all was increasing in the month that followed, which is May, June, July 1917. The second point had to do with his policy or his response to the policies of the provisional government. One could say, for example, what's wrong with the new trade unions? What's wrong with the 8-hour day and with other reforms that the provisional government was doing? Lenin's answer was like this, and this is in his writing and in his communication with his fellow party members. It doesn't matter what the provisional government is doing. Whatever they're doing is not good enough. That is the position of the Bolsheviks. Whatever they're doing is not good enough. For example, and this is something that I show in my book and in my research, workers want more pay. So the Bolsheviks put even more radical position. Let us equalize the pay of qualified workers and unqualified workers. Now, this is again a very unfulfillable position. There's no way you could do this, because then there's no difference. Why should somebody acquire a profession and study for a long time if he's going to be the same pay? But politically, it was very advantageous, because all the unqualified workers would turn into Bolshevik supporters, because they thought that that would bring them certain benefits. Another crazy idea that they advocated at the time was, for example, let's pay everybody a bonus from the beginning of the war for extra effort. Now, that would only lead to inflation. That would be unsustainable, but that's okay. That didn't matter if it was sustainable or not. It was something to weaken the provisional government, to make another demonstration or rally, and to promote absolutely unfulfillable goals. So this is what they were doing. Whatever the provisional government was doing is not good enough. And that was his position. The next thing that he wanted, the slogan that he put forward in May, in June, is all power to the Soviets. Now, it sounds such a simple thing. Let's just all power to the Soviets. But that is absurd for most of other political parties, because the Soviets represent, in a very incoherent manner, spontaneous elections of just the workers in the enterprises. Now, and soldiers in the army. But Russia is much more than workers and soldiers. In fact, it's not even close to being anything but representative, because there are 150 million people. Of those, about 120 million or more are peasants, and therefore they're not represented in any of these Soviets. Now, and then what about the principle of one man, one vote, if you adopt the principle all power to the Soviets? Now, Lenin had a very clever way of explaining it. He would say the Soviet government, which means his government, would guarantee the convocation of the Constituent Assembly, and the bourgeois government, supposedly the government of Mensheviks and Tsars, provisional government, was actually parties trying to sabotage or to cancel or to postpone elections to the Constituent Assembly. So the Bolsheviks were saying, we are the only party that actually can bring democracy to Russia and free elections to the Constituent Assembly because we will guarantee it by Soviet government. All this was total nonsense and rhetoric. It simply meant to acquire more popularity, because in fact it was exactly the other way around. The Bolsheviks had no intention to convene the Constituent Assembly, as is testified by their own actions later in the year, and it is the provisional government that wanted to, but they also wanted to postpone it so that they could accomplish more reforms, so that they could win elections, and therefore they were not in a hurry to have elections to the Constituent Assembly right away. But the preparatory work was going on and going on successfully. Well, this brings us to the climax of the political situation, which is June 1917, and that is when I mentioned before Kerensky starts his offensive. It ends in a disaster, and as a result of that disaster, there's a favorable situation for Lenin to act, and they would stage their first attempt to seize power, which is known in history as the July events. And that would lead to a new stage in the revolutionary escalation of 1917 that we shall consider in the forthcoming videos. At this point, thank you very much, and tell all your friends to subscribe to AP European History and Russian History with Dr. Brovkin. Thank you.